Revelation 1601. From the 7th of September 1940. Fullness of power of divine love. Justification of creation. Divine love flows to God's creatures in undiminished abundance of strength and will never diminish or be exhausted by increased use, for it is the divinity itself which expresses itself, and God is without beginning and without end. Thus his emanation must also be without beginning and without end, that is, it cannot be put into measure and form, it cannot be limited in time and space, it must always and eternally be infinite, that is, it cannot be put into measure and form, it cannot be limited in time and space, it must always and eternally be. Thus infinite, it must surpass all human conceptions. It must be unsurpassable in its effect, just as it is unimaginable in its omnipotence. Nothing could exist without divine love. Everything visible to human beings is a product of divine love. All life, all beings, the whole of creation has come forth from God's infinite love. And thus the human being stands in the midst of love. Everything that comes into contact with him is likewise God's working of love, and what is visible to him directly and indirectly conveys divine love to him. And thus everything is born out of love. God himself is the never-ending source from which divine love flows forth in ever-constant abundance. This must be understood before the sacrificial death of Christ can be understood and appreciated in its full significance for the whole of creation. Everything spiritual emanated from God, created by him out of immense love. His strength wanted to communicate itself to this spiritual being in order to make this created by him happy. The spiritual being was the product of his love. Therefore it could feel this spiritual being in exactly the same way, it could express itself in exactly the same way, that is, it could also let its will of love become form. Consequently, the creation was an incomparably blissful process which completely corresponded to God's will, for the first created spiritual substance turned to the elemental power time and again and thus consciously worked with God and from God. Subsequently, however, this spiritual being separated itself from God and likewise determined all its spiritual products to turn away from God. This spiritual being claimed for itself the strength of love which constantly flowed to it from God, it demanded love from its beings, and thus the spiritual being sought to divert the strength from God to itself, to increase its own strength and to withhold it from God. This was a beginning which was inadmissible and meant an unlawful appropriation of that which originated from God, thus spiritual substance from God. But at the same time it was an impossible beginning, for God's elementary power cannot be split up, it always and forever remains indivisible and inseparable from God. But there will of such an appropriation of that which is God's was immediately accomplished. This apostasy from God underlies the entire work of creation, and it determined the divine will to a planned intervention which was contrary to the intention of the apostate spiritual being. And God's wisdom, love and omnipotence let works come into being which were intended to bring about the final return of the apostate spiritual substance. Thus the task of creation is to guide all spiritual things back to their origin, for without divine love nothing can remain. Divine love is the original substance of everything that exists. However, the desire to distance oneself from God, the conscious opposition to God, is at the same time a rejection and desire of divine love, in that the spiritual takes up love because otherwise it would not exist, but on the other hand wants to reject it in its arrogant assumption that it can exist without divine love. God then continued to give the spiritual being the strength from himself, his flow of love, but demanded its return to the place of origin, and since this desire was not voluntarily fulfilled, it inevitably had to be brought close to God again through the path through all creation, And God's greater than great love made the path of return easier for the spiritual being by only giving it a short period of time, since it was allowed to call free will its own again. And during this short period of time it was now granted all conceivable help to accomplish its approach to God. God himself showed the being the way to achieve complete union with God. Because God's love has grasped his beings with all intimacy and does not want to lose any of them. And thus he demonstrated the last earthly path to his creatures and proved to them the strength and power of love which unites the being that emerged from God intimately with God again and shapes the being into a happiness-sensing and happiness-giving bearer of light, so that it can create and shape again as it is its actual destiny from eternity. Amen.